we might as well begin. Let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this new day, and we thank you for the chance to be together. Brisker morning. We pray, Lord, that you would once again be with us, open the eyes of our heart, help us to learn and grow and see, and grow in knowledge of you. So hear our prayer now in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. So we're in Gospel of John, chapter 5. Did I mess up with the copying?
Very interesting. Well, this one is from last week. I think he has a couple of other ones.
There's some new ones there.
Yeah, there's a couple of new.
But some of the ones that I did on the copy machine, I didn't put the second side on, so, all right, we're fine. No, I have it all wrong. All right, so let's read the story, and I'll read it in the NIV. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there was there in Jerusalem near the Sheep's Gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. There were a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone comes and gets in ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.' So they asked him, 'Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?' The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you.' The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who made him well. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, 'My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I am working too.'" Okay. Last week, if you remember, I asked you what the story was about, and that launched us into some interesting conversations. Now, a little bit of background commentary. On this sheet, there are 3 quotes from 2 commentaries, and the identification of the commentaries are down below, one by Frederick Bruner, the other by Raymond Brown. A little note on carrying things on the Sabbath. Carrying things on the Sabbath was particularly prohibited. I wasn't aware of these 2 Old Testament passages, Jeremiah 17:21 and Nehemiah 13:15. So Jesus, to us at first apparently peripheral command to pick up your mat, seems to be to the devout of the time to be a deliberately provocative. When the healed man explained that 1, the man who made me well, had 2, told him to pick up his mat and start walking, we wonder which of these 2 facts will grip the questioners most: the miraculous healing of the man sick for 38 years, or the comparatively trivial carrying of a mat on the Sabbath. Unhappily, it seems to be the surely minor mat-carrying second fact, and not the major life-changing first fact, that grips them most. And this calculus demonstrates immediately the sickness of the current religious system and its distortion of values. They surely should have asked, who healed you? There, who told you to pick up your mat is small-minded and is already a self-indictment in the case commencing. Jesus' condemnation of religious legalism is as deep and as earth-shaking as his healing of sickness. Indeed, Jesus' critique of legalism is itself his attempt to heal, attempted healing of a major sickness. All right, well, let's dig into this a little bit deeper. Now, the facts of the case are such, and if you remember last week, what did we note about what is Jesus' seeming intent for this incident? He's challenging work on the Sabbath. Do you think Jesus' main goal is a rule change?
He's challenging their priorities.
Okay, he's challenging their priorities. What do you mean? Flesh that out a little bit more.
Well, he's challenging the fact that they're more concerned with the small details as opposed to the big picture.
Okay. And in fact, they're
like micromanaging.
Okay. The words they're using express their priorities. And as we said before, well, so maybe we should ask a question. What are their priorities which are expressed by their focus of attention on the mat carrying? How is that? I mean, in almost, let's say we sit down, I sit down with an unhappy couple, and they've been fighting about something for a long time. And one of them tells me that, well, I'll use my grandparents. They weren't a particularly unhappy couple, but they'd been married a long time by the time I was a college kid. And I would go and visit my grandparents. They were living in Raybrook Manor, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And one day I get there and Grandma's just hopping mad. Grandpa leaves his dirty, they only have these little 2 rooms. That's their little retirement space. Grandpa keeps leaving his dirty, so they have a bedroom and then the living room. Grandpa keeps leaving his dirty socks in the living room. And Grandma's just madder than a wet cat. Now, my grandmother didn't suffer things quietly. That just wasn't her way. At this point, my grandfather was getting a little bit senile. And so I, coming in as a college kid, would look at this and think, boy, in the great scheme of things, leaving a little pair of socks here that all you really have to do is pick up and walk into the next room and throw in the hamper or the laundry basket. That doesn't seem like a grand thing, but it was driving my grandmother crazy.
And I can see why.
Oh, okay. Well, talk to me about that.
Because it's nasty.
Okay. Why? Okay, let's dig down. Disrespectful. Hey, now we're getting somewhere. It's not really about the socks, is it?
No, it's disrespectful. She wants her house clean. She wants it a certain way, and he's messing it up.
Right. Why does she want her house clean and in a certain way?
Well, isn't there some Bible verse about cleanliness? Yeah, something like that.
As a guy,
Yeah, that's one of those things out of that other Bible that.
Right, where we take a little bit and.
That's right. That's right. Well, the Old Testament clean laws. Well, that's pretty close to godliness, but the point of the matter for her was not the socks. Okay? The socks were incidental in some ways. The socks were an expression of something deeper. So this, in effect, is their sitting room. She wants it nice. She wants it nice for visitors. She wants it nice for herself. The niceness of the room reflects on her. All right, so go ahead.
Why can't you pick up his socks? He don't have to pick up our socks.
You could have taken them off in a bedroom.
There you go.
Well, and the funny thing, well, the not funny thing was, the thing that was apparent to everyone except her was that he was slowly losing his mental capacity. Because every day when I would go to visit them, he was sitting there in his chair reading, and every day of the week he would be wearing a nice shirt and a necktie. And once my aunt bought him just a pullover shirt that you couldn't put a tie on, and he never wore it. And she said, "Dad, why don't you wear that shirt I bought you?" Well, Grace likes it. Grace likes it when I look nice, and she likes me in a tie. So unless, earlier years that's the kind of man he was. See, that's really important detail in this story. Because if he were in full control of his faculties, he would not have left his socks in that room simply because he knew she wouldn't like it. Because every day of the week, he put on a nice shirt and a tie, not because he wanted to, but because he knew it pleased her. Go ahead, Barbara.
Being the closest person to him, you said she didn't realize that he was losing his mental faculty?
Well, people are complicated when you get to things like this. Because it could be realization, it could also be denial.
Yeah.
That she didn't want to admit she was slowly losing this husband who had been, for the most part, a remarkably kind and generous husband. The last drive they took, so they lived in Michigan, my parents lived in New Jersey. The last drive they took from Michigan to New Jersey, we did with them because the family didn't want them driving alone, so myself and my sister, who were going to college in Michigan, drove back. And Michigan to New Jersey was about a 12 to 14 hour drive. I sat in the front seat because she wasn't driving anymore because her eyes weren't good. So, because men drive cars, okay, this is that generation. So he and I would do all the driving, and she and my sister would sit in the back seat. It drove my sister crazy. Because we would sit in the front seat and she would say, "I am a little warm." Turn up the air conditioning. 10, 15 minutes later, "Now I'm a little cold." Adjust it again. 14 hours of this. That man did not complain once. He had 60 years of training. And my sister and I are watching this thinking, gosh, we're college students. But, so, he would do anything for this woman. He loved her deeply. He was patient. He was kind. He was generous. He endured. Okay? And my grandmother was a wonderful woman. But, like I said, she did not suffer things quietly. So, when she was complaining about him not picking up his socks, everybody in the family knew. This is a symptom of his diminished capacities, because still those days he would sit there with a shirt and tie on because he knew that the tie pleased her. But he just didn't recognize everything he was doing. But she couldn't tolerate it. But again, even so, the socks were not just about the socks. The socks were about her. The socks were about her in the world. The socks were about a whole lot of things that they're not just socks. And if you have something like Edie's job and you sit down with people, you realize that that's true of all of us. The little things that we're doing, they're seldom about the little things. They're usually about how those things tie in with our whole picture of the world. So here's the question. The religious leaders are looking at the map. How does the walking and carrying the mat tie in with the rest of the world? Because Jesus is picking this fight. And we want to hear, we tend to have an idea about there's a certain story that within the Christian Reformed tradition kind of goes like this. The Jews were legalists, and then Jesus comes and set aside the law. Well, you can read that story and read that, because, Sabbath observance gets changed in the course of the Christian church. So that's one frame of looking at the question. But I want us to look at it a lot deeper, because the way this usually goes is that the Jews, they were legalists. And then we hop to the 16th century and we learn that the Roman Catholic Church, well, they were legalists too. And then we jump to the Protestant Reformation. They're not legalists. But then you grow up in the Christian Reformed Church, and maybe you've got Roman Catholic people sitting next to you or living next to you, and you realize here in the Christian Reformed Church, we don't go shopping on Sunday. We don't go out to eat on Sunday. We actually have a whole lot of rules that we follow that the Roman Catholics aren't following. So then we begin to say, now wait a minute. Who's the legalist? Oh, then it's salvation by works. Okay, so the Jews believed in salvation by works. The Roman Catholics believed in salvation by works. We believe in salvation by grace. But previous generations, woe be to you if you go out to eat on Sunday. And, so you're young and growing up in this, and you hear these stories, and you begin to say, wait a minute, maybe we're not just dealing with legalism, and maybe we're not just dealing with law versus grace, because if you ask Roman Catholics, they'll say, oh no, we're saved by grace. And you're like, wait, but then what do you say to the Roman Catholic? Oh no, you're lying because of, and that conversation just doesn't get you too far. And remember, 50 years ago, the Christian Reformed Church and many other Protestant churches were far more anti-Catholic, and before World War II, all of these churches were far more anti-Semitic. So there's a lot going on here. And so the answer to this question is not just, well, the Jews didn't believe in carrying the mat. Because you might be tempted then to say, well, Jesus just sets aside all these laws. But then you'd have to read the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, Moses says you ought not to divorce, or you ought not to commit adultery. But I say to you, you ought not to look with lust. And someone might say, well, is that a new law? And if it's a new law, should we keep it? In other words, the frame of legalism versus no legalism, law-keeping versus not law-keeping, doesn't go deep enough into the question, especially of what this story's about. Because once we get past verse 17, and that's why I give you the other page, where the discourse gets going, the discourse isn't so much about law-keeping. The discourse is about who Jesus is. Okay? So now, what we're getting into is, well, what is the law for? Because someone might hear this law-keeping thing and say, oh, Christians, well, and let's say they go to a generation ago, they go to a Billy Graham crusade. And Billy Graham says, Christians, come as you are. That's come down and receive Jesus and your sins are forgiven. And that's all true. But now, they come down as they are. They pray the sinner's prayer. They're hooked up with a counselor. They start going to church. And so the counselor says, okay, well, here's our church. Let's see you next Sunday. The person could say, wait a minute. I listened to Billy, And he said, all I had to do was march down there, say this prayer, my sins would be forgiven, I'm going to heaven, I'm set. Now you're telling me I've got to go to church. And once he starts going to church, more things are going to come, right? What else is going to come? Tithing. Well, now you want my money. Sexual ethic. What, I can't sleep with whoever I want anymore? And so, they're going to say, hey, there's a huge bait and switch going on here. First you say, there's nothing I can do to be saved. All I got to do is walk down here and pray the little prayer, and I did that, and I talked to the guy. And now you're telling me I got to go to church, I got to give their money, I got to stop sleeping with my girlfriend, baby's got to stop drinking and smoking, and I got to start telling the truth. And you're piling all this stuff on me. You said you were the people without the rules, that the Catholics and the Jews had all the rules and we don't have them.
Well, what they told him at the Billy Graham, that was true.
It was. And that's the point. They didn't lie to them, but you can understand the misunderstanding, because even though Christians say we're saved by grace, Christians at the same time have standards of behavior that are enforced by the community.
They should say those things will enhance your walk with Christ.
Oh, so yeah, well, this is exactly what the church has been doing for the last 20 years. They've reframed it within a cultural framework that says, oh, this is how you can enjoy being a Christian better. And that's true too. But the person might say, I enjoy sleeping in on Sunday, I don't enjoy giving my money to an organization, and I like sleeping with my girlfriend, thank you very much. So if those are the value addeds, I'll pass on those. I'll take the base model. And if you think I'm making this up, talk to people. And if you see it from their point of view, you can understand why they think this way. And if you teach this story from the point of view of mere legalism, it sets you down that road, and some smart person's going to come along and say, now wait a minute, I've been hanging around you Christians too. You've got all sorts of social norms that you attach and you pin on status, and you enforce them. If I do such and such and such a thing, you don't let me take communion, or you don't let me serve as an officer in your church, or. So then they say, well, then your talk about saved by grace, not by works, seems kind of hollow. And you could throw that back at the Apostle Paul too. Read the book of Corinthians, where he says sleeping with prostitutes stuff, you should leave that behind. Well, Paul, you're the one that says saved by grace, not because of works, lest any man should boast. And then you say sleeping with prostitutes you shouldn't do. Now again, sitting in this nice Christian room after 2,000 years of Christian expectations of behavior, that doesn't surprise any of us. In fact, it's gotten so entrenched in our culture that, well, some of you who've lived in Sacramento long enough. I was talking to Evelyn. She was talking about the fact that, 50, 60 years ago, down towards downtown, they had... Now today, if you say a cat house, if I would say cat house, you know what my kids would think? A house with a lot of cats. That's right. But talk to someone 50, 60, 70 years ago and you say cat house, what do they think of?
House of ill repute.
A house of ill repute. We have all these euphemisms around it. But, the culture has changed that much to the point of, oh, you've made prostitution illegal. Someone in the 19th century would think, well, that's just kind of crazy. Christians didn't like prostitution, but it was legal. Here in the 20th century, no, prostitution is illegal. I mean, there's a lot going on here that we pay no attention to because we're simply accustomed to the frameworks that we deal with. Okay? So here's my question. Just like my grandmother attached to the socks, what's attached to the mat? And carrying the mat. Now here, here on we've got Jeremiah 17:21 and Nehemiah 13:15. Jesus knew those verses. Jesus' point is intentionally, this is again something that we should pay attention with Jesus. Jesus is provocative. Jesus is sometimes comforting. He's really comforting. In fact, sometimes he's so comforting that people are offended by to whom and to the degree he will offer them comfort. He is also provocative. And people are offended to the degree to whom and over what he provokes. And this is an example of that. He is picking a fight. He went to Jerusalem, he looked for this pool, he found this guy, and he's picking a fight. Now, when we hear that the guy was there 38 years, we imagine in our mind, because this is a new kind of way of thought that we've been working, this man is a needy man and suddenly in our minds, this man is deserving of Jesus' healing power. Now, just last week or the week before, there was a very high-profile court case in Los Angeles. I think it was in LA. Very high-profile man. You know who I'm talking about?
Weinstein.
Yeah. And did you notice, before, some people made quite a bit of this, before the sentencing and before the trial, how did he go into court every day?
On his walker.
On his walker. Someone took a picture of him leaving the court after the sentencing without the walker in the sand. One of these miraculous healings that happens in court. And you know this because it's so funny because when there's this dirt bomb, guy who's on trial for some petty thing, they dress him up in a suit to go to court to make him look a little better so the jury doesn't think he's a dirt bomb. Harvey Weinstein goes to court for rape charges, and what does he wheel into the court? Why? Sympathy.
Sick old man.
He's a sick old man. It must have been a misunderstanding. He couldn't hurt anyone. I mean, these lawyers that he's paying more money than any of us have, they're not dumb. They know that even though on one hand you might look at this and say, that's a con. On the other hand, it still plays to our sympathies.
East Side rapist.
What's that?
East Side rapist came in and West came in. His neighbor was saying he'd been riding his motorcycle. So this old guy, 38 years old, we in our minds see him as sort of a innocent guy. When we look at things, we look at them in very small profiles. Let's say you're in your house at night, you hear some noise, you get up, you look in the living room, it's dark, you see somebody. What is the tiny little bit of information that is most relevant in that moment? You don't look at the color of their skin. You don't look at a whole list of things. You just see a person in your house that don't belong. That's all you see. And now you might not even see the person because there's plenty of examples of people who have guns, for just such an instant. They hear someone in the house, they get up, they see someone in the dark, they shoot them, they turn on the light, and they realize they just shot a member of their family. I mean, that happens. That probably happens more than people shooting burglars. But the thing is, when you see the guy in the living room, you just see the situation. You don't really see much about the person at all. Now, stories are always like that. and people have noted repeatedly, for all of the Gospels, there's some really interesting details that we don't have about Jesus. Any idea of probably the one that comes to mind most often? We have no idea what Jesus looked like. None of the gospel writers took the time to write a physical description of Jesus.
But didn't they say he has hair that looks like wool? Isn't that part of his description?
You think he would look like the other men?
Well, yeah, he would look like
Yeah, the Jewish men.
someone of the race and age of his day. So he was definitely darker skinned than I am. Probably had thicker hair than I do. Especially now. Everybody laughs. But it's really interesting. We don't know if he was tall or short. We don't know any. And the thing is, the Bible doesn't have a lot of that, but there is some of that. And you think someone as important as Jesus, but that wasn't what right. Just like with the burger in the house, that wasn't what captured his attention. Now, for this guy at the pool, what do we know about him?
They've been there a long
They're
time.
there a long time.
Crippled, 38 years.
He been crippled longer than Jesus had been alive.
That's right. That's right. It's a great point. Now, some people look at 38 and make the observation, which is a good observation. When you get numbers in the Bible, you got to pause and think about those numbers, because we think about numbers in a particular way after the scientific revolution. I'm not saying you hadn't been there for 38 years, but the number 40 is a really important number. And 38 is too shy of 40. Commentators throughout history have noted this. Also, one of the things we find is we compare this story to a little bit later in John chapter 9, where we're going to run into another guy, a man born blind. And that man born blind, he's a real character. We're going to get that in this. But in this, here in chapter 5, the paralytic, we begin to see some little tiny clues about this person. For example, Jesus seems to see the person. And Jesus' comment to the man, Jesus finds him again at the temple and says to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning or something worse might happen to you."
Well, and when he first comes to him, he says, "Do you want to be made well?"
You are to what?
Do you want to be made well?
I mean,
And we would all think, oh, of course. But I'll tell you something, and Edie will tell you even more. A lot of us don't want to be well.
Maybe he was being given coins that, he could then go out and have a nice meal.
Maybe he liked being a beggar.
Yeah.
I mean, I deal with people, over on the other side of the church right now, this guy named Billy's out sitting out there. Billy, nobody put a gun to Billy's head and said, "Sleep outside of Livingstone's church." Nobody puts a gun to Billy's head when he wakes up somewhere halfway through the day to find his drug dealer to do drugs. Nobody put a gun to Billy's head for any of this stuff. They might say, well, he's trapped by his addiction. Well, that might be. Well, he's trapped by his depression. Well, that might be. But it's funny the way we kind of embrace some of our maladies, isn't it? So again, with this guy, it's interesting. And see, the thing is, we can fill positive or negative things in, and cultures almost always do. So there's, let's say, the guys that sit in the middle of the street here panhandling at stoplights. Some people look at them and say, "Oh, that poor person. I should give them some money." Some people drive by there and say, "Oh, yeah, get a job." Or, you're already getting Social Security, get into a group home and have someone take care of you. Because, you work long enough here on the corner, you get to know these people. They're almost all getting government support. So why are you panhandling? Well, the government support isn't a lot of money. Well, where's all your money going? A lot of the people I know, their money doesn't last the first week. And they don't have any rent, they don't pay any taxes, well, where's all the money going? The money's going somewhere. Well, how do we think about them? Do we say they're an alcoholic, it's their fault? Well, now we've had 100 years of AA saying, oh, it's a disease. Okay, they're an alcoholic, they're a victim. But if you live with an alcoholic, and if you live with someone who's kind of on the edge of a fairly functional alcoholic, a lot of people who are living with them are like, they could pick up their socks, couldn't they? So these lines are a big deal. So this guy, on one hand, yeah, he's crippled. But we don't know what caused him to be a cripple. We don't know how he spends his time. Do you think everyone who is infirm is a really golden person that would have a wonderful life if, in fact, their infirmity was healed? If you think that, you've probably never worked with a lot of infirm people. Because you know what? They're people. And you know what? People come in, you find some really sweet gems who are patient, kind, and do all they can for others. And you find real horrible people who victimize and take advantage and play all kinds of games, and you find pretty much everybody in between. That's what you find with people. And you find some people who are really gems in one aspect and horrible in another, and that's what you find with people. So Jesus comes to this guy and says, hey, look, so you're well again. Stop sinning or something worse might happen. And again, we listen to this and we think, oh, Jesus, that's so cruel. But if Harvey Weinstein was acquitted and Jesus popped in, oh, Harvey, you got acquitted. Stop sinning or something worse might happen to you. We wouldn't have a problem with that. But the man's so low resolution, we don't have any idea, so we immediately jump in with our judgments, right? Based on So basically what we do, just like in the idea of a burglar, if there's something that lacks information, we fill in all of the details according to the story we wish to tell. And that's not a bad thing, that's a normal human thing, and we have to do it because the world is too large and complex and you have to get on with life. So if you walk in the dark room at night and you see someone who isn't supposed to be there, and you have a gun, bad things might happen. You might shoot a member of your family, you might shoot a burglar, or you might shoot yourself. These things happen because the truth is, if it's in the middle of the night and you're pulling sleepies from your eyes, it's probably not the best time of day to handle a gun. But anyway, and this is what life is like. Okay, so he's carrying a mat. Now again, like Grandpa's socks, what was that mat hooked up to for the Jews? Because they're not stupid. And the Old Testament law is not immoral. It was connected up with something. And in fact, it was connected up with a whole history. And again, this is, so before Lent, I was working on Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, and I want to get back to that because to figure out how these things work together are really important. Because on one hand, we are saved by grace. That's true. On the other hand, Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, obey my commandments. How do those things work together? And churches have in fact been wrestling with this all along, and we're not going to stop wrestling with it. So now, why are the rulers of the law offended at the mat? Oh, it's legalism. It's not just legalism.
It's part of a tradition.
It's part of a tradition. Okay. What's that tradition tied up with?
Control.
About control. What else?
Keep the Sabbath holy.
Keep the Sabbath holy. And again, if you know, like Marty or Edie or I, you know, if you grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, that was one of the rules we learned, right? And we kept the Sabbath holy. And if you grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, in order to keep the Sabbath holy, it meant you went to church twice, you didn't go out to a restaurant, and that little in-between period between church in the morning and afternoon, what did you do?
Take a nap.
Some people did. Had a nap.
Had a nap.
Went to the
Bread.
nursing home to visit grandma.
Or visit.
Went to the nursing home to visit grandma.
Yeah. Or had your relatives over.
Had your relatives over. You did things that the community said this is the proper way to keep the Sabbath holy. And you know what? And a lot of what happened in the 60s and 70s, beginning there and all the way into the 90s, is the CRC left that tradition. And the reason it left it was younger generation said, that's legalism. Oh, because we know what to do with legalism. We don't want to be a legalist, so I'm going to go to the store on Sunday. And that's how I'm going to show I'm not a legalist. Well, maybe. But maybe the CRC had some legalism about it. But you know what? If you looked at the whole picture, that was actually a really fine way to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, because you know all kinds of things all kinds of good things were practiced in that. You had people took time to be with family, which is a value we now have probably a little higher than then. People took time to reflect, to visit people in nursing homes. I mean, to rest. There was a lot of good stuff that actually happened because of that legalism. Now the legalism, that aspect of it wasn't good, but the practice itself was good.
But wasn't necessarily legalism.
No, I don't think it was either.
No.
But that was the justification for the rejecting of it by people. So, but that's exactly the point. It was this, and that's what probably church people explained to the guy who went down the aisle at the Billy Graham crusade would say. Said, no, that's just legalism, all the rules you're getting. And the church people would say, all right, we don't see it as legalism. We think this is a better way to live. But to have the two people understand each other, that's hard. So the mat is connected, of course, to, and we talked about this, the exile and the covenant. And, you know, keep the covenant. Well, why should we keep the covenant? Well, if you keep the covenant, you'll be blessed. And, you know, I think CRC tradition of Sabbath keeping was a blessing to the denomination. Yeah, go ahead.
And what's to say if they allowed Jesus to break the rules, that others would not follow suit?
Exactly. Well, and that's how communities enforce behaviors. And again, we live in a culture right now that likes to say, well, we're a very libertarian culture. We're against communities reinforcing behaviors. Oh, really? Wow. Let me try this. Let me get a swastika and march down Florin Road, and we'll see whether or not we're all libertarian. I don't think so. Because you don't have a community unless in that community you actually have things that the community says, these are good and these are bad. Because those things create expectations of behavior. You know, that's just what a community is. But now we get these ideas that we're a very open and free community. Well, compared to some we are, but if I pay enough attention, especially to what gets people upset, oh, I'll be able to fill in these for you. It isn't really that hard. Because in just about every community, there's someone around who really likes pushing buttons. And they'll find them, don't worry. And then we'll begin to notice, these are the things we value, these are the things we discourage. Every community is like that. All right, so Jesus wants to have a conversation about, well, that's the question. He wants to have a conversation about Sabbath. But you know who he really wants to have a conversation about? I am. Well, that's weird. What is I am? Well, that's the name of God.
The name, yeah.
So Jesus sees this man, and this man isn't just some, we get this little insight into this man. And this little insight that Jesus gives us into this man, that he might not be little tiny Tim, who is innocent as the driven snow. Merry Christmas, everyone. He might be Harvey Weinstein, wheeling his, he might be the biggest dirt bomb at the pool. And it might be that nobody wanted to give this man a lift into the pool, maybe because he was laying there every day cussing everybody out. That could be. We don't know. 38 years, you can't find one person willing to give you a hand? I've known people like this. You probably have too. He couldn't just be a wretched human being. And Jesus says, I'll pick him. And that would be just like Jesus. And we would all like to imagine Jesus looks around, sees into everyone's heart, finds the most deserving person amongst all the crippled people there, and heals them. Wouldn't that make a nice Hallmark movie?
But that's not what happens, especially I think it's in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians.
That's right. Could be. Jesus looked around. This is the biggest dirt bomb by the pool. I'm going to heal him. Could be. We don't know. Okay? But that would be like Jesus because, again, he's looking to provoke. And, again, we don't hear celebrations from the religious leaders that this man is healed. We just hear about the man. Again, focusing in on the details that the story wants us to see. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, my Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. All right, now back to this commentary sheet. When Jesus is accused of violating the Sabbath, the synoptic tradition, well, what does that mean? What's the synoptic tradition? It's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're reading in John. So when we're looking at the Gospel of John, we're often comparing it to what's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this issue of Sabbath keeping comes up all the time. Okay? And John is a special thing, so sometimes we can sense emphasis and purpose in the author of John by comparing it to the synoptics. So the synoptic tradition records two ways in which he, meaning Jesus, defends himself. A, on humanitarian grounds. Jesus argues that on a Sabbath, a man may water an animal or pull it out of a hole. Therefore, why may he not do the greater good of healing a man? You can find this in Luke 13 and Luke 14. Something approaching the argument may be found in John 7:23. Okay, we're not there yet. If a man may be circumcised on the Sabbath, why may not the whole man be made well on Sabbath? So that's a point that Jesus makes. And that's probably under here. But the discourse after isn't really going to focus on that point. B, on theological grounds. In the synoptic tradition, Jesus argues that the Old Testament priests of the temple were allowed to do work on Sabbath. Now, for me growing up, this was a question that occurred to me when I was a child because my father was a minister. Other daddies didn't work on Sunday. Guess whose daddy worked every Sunday? What's with that? Well, the Old Testament priests of the temple were allowed to do work on the Sabbath. Yet now, something greater than the temple is present. Matthew 12, 5-6. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Matthew 12, 8. This type of argument leads to the majestic claim by Jesus, and our present passage in John is quite similar. We're getting clues from Raymond Brown. In particular, as regards men, divine activities was visible in two ways. Men were born and men died on the Sabbath. Bet you never thought that in terms of work, did you? The Jews did. Since only God could give life, and only God could deal with the fate of the dead in judgment, this meant that God was active on the Sabbath. As Rabbi Johanan put it, God has kept his hand three keys that he entrusts to no agent. The key to the rain, the key of birth, and the key of resurrection of the dead. Isn't this interesting? And it is obvious to the rabbis that God used these keys even on the Sabbath. It rains on the Sabbath, therefore God is working. 5:17, Jesus justifies his work of healing on the Sabbath by calling the attention of the Jews to the fact that they admitted that God worked on the Sabbath. Now we're beginning to see where Jesus is going with this. And now we're going to begin to see why the provocation of the mat is a little provocation, not in comparison necessarily to the healing that was done, but by virtue of the claims that Jesus is going to make about himself. This is really going to upset them. And rightly so. That the implication of this arguments were immediately apparent is witnessed by the violence of the reaction. For the Jews, the Sabbath privilege was peculiar to God, and no one was equal to God. In claiming the right to work, even as his Father worked, Jesus was claiming a divine prerogative. Remember last week I said, what's this story about? Well, it's about a man getting healed. Yeah, it is. That's just the start. Jesus, and see, here's the thing that I keep presenting to people. So I'll sometimes do these little debates with atheists, and they'll say things like, well, we don't know if Jesus really lived, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, first of all, historically, that's really a non-starter, that we just made this guy up out of whole cloth. Secondly, if we had, according to our purposes, we wouldn't have made one up like him. Each generation would have made up a Jesus according to the kind of Jesus that they want to have. And that's not this guy. Say, okay, so you don't buy any of the miracles and you don't buy any of the supernatural stuff. Okay. What are the two things we really historically know about Jesus? Well, for most of us, it'd be the only two things that's known of us 200 years from now.
Born and he died.
Born and died. Everything that happens in the middle is low resolution. All right? Here's the thing about Jesus. How did he die? The piece of data you can find about Jesus outside of the Christian record is in fact his death. Now his death obviously presupposes he was born, but the one thing you can find outside of the Christian record, even just from a couple of people, is he was killed by the Romans. Why did the Romans kill people? Well, the Romans would kill a Jew in Judea for the most part for one reason, and they were really good at it. What did the Romans care about? Themselves. And keeping power. Keeping power. And crucifixion. We know Jesus was crucified. Romans didn't just crucify common criminals. Romans crucified people as a political statement about Roman hegemony and control of the region. Jesus threatened Rome. Okay. So now we're looking for maybe some of these other details in here. We have zero indication that Jesus was like all these other people that Romans crucified. All these other people that Romans crucified, they're trying to stir up a mob and a mass group of people to threaten Roman power. Jesus didn't do any of that. So now we dig a little deeper. Well, forget all the supernatural stuff. Why did Jesus tick off his own people so bad?
I agree with them.
You know, if there's one thing we know about the Jews historically that the Romans figured out, they learned it from the Greeks, because the Greeks are like, oh, these Jews are so backwards. You go into their temple, they just got nothing in there. You know what? You know what the Jews need in their temple? They need a god. So, you know, the Lord, Zeus, they're all the same. Let's put a statue of Zeus in the temple. Here, my little Jewish people who don't know how to do religion right, here's a statue of Zeus. We're going to put it in the temple. And what did the Greeks learn?
Nope.
The Jews said, over my dead body, and they meant it. And so the Romans learned, we can kill Jews all day long, or we can let them have their silly empty temple. And that's what they did. So why would the Jews get so upset at Jesus? Son of a gun, it's right here in the book.
Claim to be God.
It fits perfectly with the whole picture, starting from the tiny little fact of his resurrection. He claimed to be God. Now, from that point, you might ask, what kind of a nice Jewish boy would ever dare to do something like that? That's just crazy talk. In fact, that's even crazy talk with pagans, because pagans might claim to be a son of the gods. Well, if you're going to be that, well, in the sermon today I got this nice illustration out of India where this guy, for the last, the world is a crazy place. This guy in India, for the last 3 years, has been worshiping Donald Trump as a god.
That is crazy.
But here's the thing. We hear that and we say that's crazy. But he's from India. Indians are very attuned. In fact, their religion hasn't changed much from antiquity. If you would be ancient Greek and Roman, it would make a whole lot of sense to worship Donald Trump as a god. Why?
Emperor worship.
He's got lots of money. He has a harem, but in America he's only allowed to have one at a time. He has to keep the other ones on the side. Donald Trump does everything like an ancient pagan son of a god. He's got power, he's got wealth, he's got women, that's what gods do. And so this guy has taken it upon himself to worship Donald Trump as a god. And Donald Trump just went to India, and the guy's like, I'm waiting for my invitation. I've been worshiping for the last 3 years, Come on! Who else? Where's a bigger fan of Donald Trump? This guy actually made a statue of him and does offerings to him. I'll have it on the screen at 11 o'clock. The dude's doing it. But it makes sense if you understand the ancient world. That's what a god was. That's not what Jews thought. Jews didn't think that at all. The one place in the world where, to have a Jew make the kind of claims that Jesus is, Jesus saying, yeah, I heal on the Sabbath. Well, let's read the next verse. Verse 19, Jesus gave them this answer. Very truly I tell you. Now there's just one of these verily, verilies. Remember? King James says verily, verily. LEB says truly, truly. NLT says, I tell you the truth. But in the Greek, it's an accent. And when Jesus says these things, you pay special attention because Jesus is putting the emphasis on it. I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. Oh boy. Jesus set this whole thing up. Picked this guy, might be a dirt bomb, healed him, slipped into the crowd, let the guy go up, taught her, carry his little mat across the way, There's Harvey, thou shalt not push a walker on the Sabbath. There's Harvey pushing his walker. Hey, wait a minute. What you doing pushing that walker? Who told you to push that walker? I don't know. And then Jesus stops in on him again. Psst, hey, the walking thing's going pretty good. You better stop sinning or something worse might happen. How dare Jesus say this to a crippled invalid? Yeah, maybe he's Harvey Weinstein. Who knows?
You might end up on that pool again.
That's right. And then, it's Jesus. And then, so then they find Jesus. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. Only sees what his Father is doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son does also. So this isn't one of these little Alexander the Great, Donald Trump, Caesar Augustus gods. This is the Jewish God. And Jesus is claiming this for himself. The fur is about to fly, and this is why we're going to have this long discourse. And it isn't just about the Sabbath, but that's built into it. Because for the Jews, the Sabbath idea is deeply connected with God and the kingdom of God and life the way it's supposed to be. So, we're out of time today, but if you just keep reading a little bit, you'll see where we're going. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, remember on this sheet what one of the lists of the things that God does on the Sabbath? God gives life, that's birth. God raises life. Now that's connected with Sabbath deeply. And God causes rain. So Jesus pings it here. Even so, the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Remember when I asked you last week, why didn't Jesus heal everyone there at the pool? The point of picking on one, though he may have been a dirtbag, is the point that, you know what? God picks and chooses. So does Jesus. Here's an idea we don't like. We like democracy. Fair. Everyone gets the same. Boom, boom, boom. Jesus says, I'm in charge here. I pick and choose. Now we're offended.
I will have mercy on whom
I will have mercy. And that's the thing about the Bible. It's so often, in our democratic way of thinking, an equal opportunity offender. Everybody's offended by it. Just in different ways. We're not offended by Jesus calling himself God. We've had 2,000 years to get used to that. But Jesus picks a dirt bomb to heal? Maybe. Again, we don't know. Suggests it by the sinning comment. Wait till we meet the next guy, the man born blind. And the man born blind, he's just hysterical because they start questioning him. At first they start questioning his parents, and his parents are like, why are you asking us? He's an adult. They're getting out of the pressure. And they ask him, and he's like, why are you asking me? Do you want to worship him too? I mean, the guy just is, he knows exactly what buttons to push in them. And he's pushing them. And they're all there in the story. Which, to me, again, people say, these are all made-up stories. I've seen a lot of made-up stories. These stories just ring true. They are full of tiny little tidbits that you say, no one was smart enough to make this stuff up. Not much less for almost anonymous random writers out of the first century could write a book so compelling that for the last 2,000 years, people from every culture and almost every place can read it and say, huh, and it holds our interest. But that's the truth. Okay, we're out of time. Let's pray. Lord, the idea that Jesus is God in the way that the Jews understood the God. Lord, there's a reason that we say this book is the Word of God. And there's a reason we come back to these books again and again. There's a reason we don't get to the bottom of them. There's a reason they're fun to read and fun to talk about and fun to discuss and fun to play with, because they're just too amazing. Help us, Lord, to not get distracted by things that are less worthwhile. May we see Jesus through the book and all of the amazing glory and annoyance sometimes in which the people saw him 2,000 years ago. Hear our prayer in his name. Amen.